Come in, polar bear. Come in, Fucky Fuck. Come in, owl. Huggy toy tiny.
Come around now, you little cubs, and listen to how polar bears and grizzly bears became friends. Now, naturally, you cubs might think polar bears and grizzlies always got along. Well, it isn't true. In fact, for a very long time, we were sworn enemies. Now, some polar bears will try to convince you that it was us noble grizzlies that were the problem. But don't believe any of that silliness. The truth is that polar bears were, for a very long time, notoriously vain and arrogant creatures. Now, I don't want to be too tough on them. Like I said, we're all friends now. But there was a time when things were very different. There was once a terribly vain polar bear. He used to spend day and night looking at his own reflection in the ice. Every morning he would spend an hour parting the fur on his back, cleaning the cracks and crevices in between the pads of his paws, making sure his whiskers were symmetrical and that his tail was nicely fluffed. If it was snowing, he would not leave his den to go out fishing, for fear he might get his fur wet. And if there were other polar bears around, he needed extra time to polish his nose and shine his claws, just so that they would be impressed and jealous of how neat and shiny he was. Now, to you and me, that all sounds very silly. But in the North Pole, that kind of carry-on is normal. And where you and I might think this was very vain and arrogant, all the other polar bears thought he was very shiny and special, and all the little bears wanted to be just like him when they grew up. Now, life went on like this for a very long time in the North Pole, until one day this bear was out fishing alone. Because he took so long to get ready, he was always the last bear out on the ice for dinner, and all the others had long gone home to their dens with their bellies full. It was suddenly dark, and instead of going home himself, he realized that in the low light, his fur looked beautifully white, and his eyes seemed to outshine the stars in the sky. Lost in his own reflection, he never noticed that the delicate ice shelf that he was standing on had broken away and begun to drift slowly from home. When he finally pulled his gaze from the water, it was completely dark, and he could only just see the mainland and home from his iceberg. He had to act fast. The North Atlantic is a wild sea, and tides can quickly move an iceberg miles in any direction. His instinct was to swim for home, but just as he put his paws out to jump, he stopped. It would be a sin to ruin his new manicure and freshly combed fur, he thought. What could he do to avoid such a mess, he thought, pacing over and back across his iceberg. But he pondered too long, and before he could come up with another solution, home had disappeared out of sight, and he was at the mercy of the tides. For days and days he floated, perched on his block of ice, with nothing to do but admire himself. And each day that block of ice got a little bit smaller as the water below him got warmer. It was clear he was heading south, and soon he could see, far off in the distance, little green specks, islands with no snow and no ice. He was occasionally able to snap a salmon or a trout of a passing school, so food wasn't too much of a problem. But with each passing day, he drifted farther from home and began to worry where he might end up. Eventually, and just as he had enough ice left to perch on his tippy toes, his iceberg finally hit dry land, a lush and green island. Off he jumped and immediately began to explore his new surroundings. This place was not at all like the North Pole. Aside from all of the colours and lack of ice and snow, There were trees everywhere, and hundreds of different types of animals that he had never seen before. Of course, he did not fear them. They were much smaller than him, and besides, it did not take him long to notice that they were much more interested in him than he was in them. Within a few hours, all the animals of the forest were following him from a distance, whispering and admiring him. Eventually, a plucky squirrel from the safety of his tree asked, "Who are you?" "I am Polar Bear. I came here on a boat made of ice." "Wow," said a little brown rabbit. "That sounds very brave. Where did you come from?" "A land of ice and snow, far away, where polar bears are beautiful and admired in equal measure," said Polar Bear. "Wow," squeaked a small hedgehog. "Was it difficult to get here?" "It took all I had, but I never gave up, and I always believed in myself." "You sound like the bravest bear ever," said a baby deer, poking his head out from behind his mother's legs. "I do not like to boast, but I was indeed brave. I sailed the wild seas for weeks and weeks on end, with nothing but my sailing knowledge and hunting skills to keep me alive. There were stormy nights where I held on to my boat with my fearsome claws, and there were days when any other polar bear would have long given up for loneliness. Truthfully, any lesser creature would not have made it. And so now I am here. I am among you, and you need not worry. As long as I am here, you will have many tales to keep you amazed." That caused a ripple of excitement through the forest. Word quickly spread that a hero had arrived from a faraway land, and all the creatures of the forest gathered to hear his great stories. It was late that night when I first met this polar bear. I had been out hunting for dinner and patrolling the borders of the forest to make sure we were all safe from intruders. When I came back to my den, there was a group of excited little critters babbling on about our new guest. They took me down to this very clearing to meet Polar Bear, who was telling a group of little cubs, just like you, about how he wrestled with two whales who wanted to use his iceberg for sunbathing, but how he fought them off even though he was half starved at the time. To be honest, he looked pretty well fed to me. Anyway, he was quickly anointed king of the forest, and all the silly little creatures took care of his every demand, bringing him fish on a platter, and all the berries and nuts a bear could eat. "How is your fur so white?" they asked like silly cubs. "How do you get your nose so shiny?" they would ask him. And this went on for about a week, before I got annoyed with his tall tales and him strutting around the forest looking for compliments. One day, when I came back from my forest patrol, I told him, "If you stay here in the forest and keep parading around, looking for attention and compliments, the men from the zoo will come down here and put you in a cage." Naturally, being arrogant, he told me that I was jealous. "I like it here," he said. "You used to be the king of the forest, but now I am. Obviously the forest creatures like me more, and who could blame them? Just look at my beautiful fur and how well I keep it. You know, you could learn a lot from me." Needless to say, I was furious, but what else could I expect from a polar bear? I went home and I was finished with him. Anyway, as time went on and Polar Bear grew more and more daring as he needed more attention, he would even go to the edge of the forest and strut around the farmers' fields, looking for compliments from the humans. He was that silly. Before long, news cameras showed up to report on this exotic bear. And of course he put on a great show for the cameras, standing up on his back legs and scratching himself off trees and rolling around like a naive cub. That obviously tipped off the zoo, and the very next day, a big van pulled up to the forest, and men with long sticks and nets jumped out to catch Polar Bear. As it just so happened, I was on my way out looking for a nice juicy chicken for lunch, when Polar Bear ran into me, terrified and looking for a place to hide. "Help! Help me, Huggy!" he cried, realizing what these men wanted. But of course, with his bright fur and shiny nose, it was impossible for him to hide, and he would be easily spotted up a tree or under a bundle of leaves. I was still annoyed with him for being so arrogant and ignoring my advice. "I told you not to be so proud," I said. I know, please help me. I'll do anything not to be put in a cage," he begged. "Well, there is only one way that you are not going to the zoo in a cage today, and that is for you to blend in." "Don't I know that, but this beautiful white fur is such a curse. I can be seen and admired for miles around." "The only thing you can do now," I said, "is to jump into that big puddle of mud over there and roll around in it until you're covered from snout to tail in dirt and mud." Well, I can tell you that Polar Bear looked horrified, and he would have thought about it until the men from the zoo caught him, only I gave him one strong push into the puddle. Oh, I laughed looking at him rolling around in the mud like a little cub being asked to eat a bucket of worms. But he did it, and just in time too. Just as he came out of the puddle, all brown and filthy, the zookeepers came along. But only seeing 2 grizzlies, they said, "No, he's not here. There are only 2 grizzlies, and they're not exotic enough for our collection. Keep looking." Of course, I had great fun for the next week, telling Polar Bear that he had to roll around in a puddle of mud every morning, just in case the men from the zoo returned. I knew that they'd long given up, but it taught Polar Bear a good lesson. Sometimes vanity and arrogance leads to nothing but trouble. After all of that, we actually became great friends. He saw that grizzlies are noble bears and can be counted on in hard times, and I admired him for being humble when he needed to be. Not long after, Polar Bear jumped on a ship heading north, and though I don't see him much anymore, I do hear stories every now and again about a brave seafaring polar bear that was saved by a noble and fair grizzly. And while I'm sure Polar Bear is still telling his tall tales, that is how I remember the story of how polar bears and grizzlies became great friends.